Part 4, we're talking Manifest Destiny, Fugitive Slave Law, Free Soilers and Free Blacks, and Nativism and the Rise of the Know-Nothings. I guess a quote to start this off, and with the senator from Mississippi, his name was Albert Gallatin Brown. Albert Brown, middle name Gallatin. And what he said was, I want Cuba. I want Tamaulipas, Potosi, and one or two other Mexican states, and a foothold in Central America. Yes, I want these countries for the spread of slavery. So that just gives you the attitude of the senators in Mississippi at that time. So, as we touched on earlier, Manifest Destiny is the idea or the belief that the expansion of the United States through the American continents was both justified and inevitable. But what would that mean for the future of slavery? In the 1850s, pro-slavery expansionists were eyeing Cuba, Central, and additional territories in Mexico. A manifest destiny all over Mexico, over South America, and over the West Indies, the Caribbean. An organization called Knights of the Golden Circle, founded in Louisville in 1854, was dedicated to the mission of establishing a golden circle including all of the southern states, Central America, and northern South America for slavery. I'm going to see if I can get a graphic of that. Jefferson Davis pressed for the acquisition of Cuba and additional Mexican territory to increase the number of slaveholding constituencies. In 1848, the Polk administration, so Cuba was a territory of Spain, so basically the Polk administration in 1848 offered Spain $100 million for Cuba, but Spain refused. Southerners tried to foment a Texas-style revolution among dissident Cuban sugar planters who wanted American annexation. So the history between America and Cuba goes deep, and I think in this slavery debate, we're gonna have to venture into Latin America, especially talking reparations. So we're gonna have to go south of the border and through the Gulf and, down to the other side, because the stories are intertwined. The Southerners tried to support Narcisco Lopez, who was a Venezuelan Cuban adventurer who had fled the island in 1848 after an abortive uprising. So Lopez recruited American volunteers to invade Cuba. This was the first of many American filibustering expeditions after the Mexican War. The word filibuster comes from the Spanish word meaning freebooter or pirate. President Zachary Taylor ordered the U.S. Navy to seize the ships of Lopez's expedition before they could sail. Lopez then reorganized a force of several hundred men and slipped out of New Orleans in 1850. He captured Cardenas and burned the governor's mansion, but the Cubans failed to rise up. So Lopez reorganized the force of several hundred men and slipped out of New Orleans in 1850. So basically he was trying to launch a mission from the United States mainland to Cuba to overthrow the Cubans and help start a revolution like Texas to help Cuba join America. So then he got the force together and he captured Cardenas, Cuba, and burned the governor's mansion, but the rest of the Cubans failed to rise up. A Spanish counterattack forced them back to Key West, Florida. The U.S. government prosecuted the leaders for violation of neutrality laws, but New Orleans juries failed to convict them. Southerners treated Lopez like a hero, and prominent Southerners helped him raise money for a third attempt. He invaded again with 500 men in August of 1851, but popular uprising failed to materialize, and this time Lopez was captured and killed. The Pierce administration made the acquisition of Cuba a primary foreign policy goal. With Cuban acquisition not materializing as expected, the expansionists shifted their attention toward Mexico and Central America. Now, the reason they wanted Cuba is because slavery was flourishing in Cuba. It was flourishing, flourishing, flourishing. So anyway, James Gadsden in 1853 tried to buy an additional 250,000 square miles of the country. Mexico refused to sell so much land and offered 54,000 square miles. Northern senators tried to cut out another 9,000 miles before approving in 1854 the Gadsden Purchase, and that resulted in the acquisition of what is now southern Arizona and New Mexico. American filibustering in Mexico came mostly from Texas and California. They launched dozens of raids, none of which were successful, and this introduces Henry Crabb and William Walker. Now, these were Tennessean-born men who made their way to California. Henry Crabb led an army of 90 men to the province of Sonora, where they were surrounded and executed in cold blood. Walker was his boyhood friend who met the same fate but went after bigger game. Walker first tried to invade Baja California and was driven back across the border. Walker stood trial in San Francisco and was acquitted. 2 years later, he invaded Nicaragua with a small army of an alliance of rebels. He overthrew the government and declared himself president. He pronounced his quest to be the first step toward the regeneration of the Central American republics by Anglo-Saxon settlers. Northern and Central American republics had different ideas. They formed an alliance to invade Nicaragua and expel Walker. Walker returned home to a hero's welcome in the South, which furnished men for a second invasion, but the American Navy stepped in and detained Walker. A New Orleans jury acquitted Walker, and Walker then made a triumphant tour of the South. He wrote a book about his experiences, and it eventually launched another filibustering expedition campaign. You gotta remember, there's no TV at the time, so they're seeing stories of this in the newspaper, and this man's going on tour, making speeches about it, and encouraging, Southerners to have their expansionist ideas actualized. So, he eventually led another filibustering expedition, and this time the Honduras militia stopped his small force, and he was killed by a Honduran fire squad on September 12, 1860. Now, to the fugitive slave issue. This went all the way back to the framing of the Constitution. Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution of the United States says that persons held in service or labor in one state who escaped to another shall be delivered upon claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. In 1793, Congress enacted a fugitive slave law that authorized slave owners to recapture their escaped slaves across state lines and bring them before any state or federal court to establish proof of ownership. This procedure worked well enough for a time, but when militant abolitionism emerged in the 1830s, the fugitive slave question became major controversy. Within the anti-slavery press, stories about the heroic flights of fugitives were publicized, and escaped slaves made the most effective anti-slavery lectures. Like I just said, there's no TV, there's no internet. So these anti-slavery stories, these heroic stories about the slave escaping, running through the woods, or even the actual slave that had escaped speaking at the anti-slavery reform lectures and things of the North, those were the most popular lectures. So the autobiographies of fugitives became the most effective anti-slavery literature. The organization of an underground railroad to help fugitives on their way to anti-slavery Yankee states, it gave Yankees an opportunity to do something practical against slavery. The Underground Railroad was never as extensive in fact as it is in legend. However, the exaggerated rumors inflamed Southern anger, as did Northern states. Personal liberty laws that were designed to prevent the kidnapping of free blacks for sale into slavery worked against the fugitive slave laws. Because if there was no other proof than the claim of someone saying, hey, that man over there is an escaped slave of mine, he escaped 5 years ago, they had no mechanism to say that or to prove it. So the northern states decided to pass personal liberty laws. Some states assured fugitives rights of habeas corpus and trial by jury. The constitutionality of these personal liberty laws came before the Supreme Court in Prigg v. Pennsylvania, 1842. So, in our reparations debate, we're going to have to examine Prigg v. Pennsylvania, 1842. This case was concerning a Maryland slave owner convicted in Pennsylvania of kidnapping after he had forcibly carried his runaway slave back to Maryland. In a divided decision, the court overturned the conviction and ruled that the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Clause was entirely a federal responsibility. Pennsylvania's law prohibiting state officers from enforcing the 1793 statute was therefore valid. This complex decision produced a new wave of personal liberty laws in the 1840s, by which 7 states prohibited their officials from helping to recapture fugitives or forbade the use of state and local jails to hold fugitives pending a decision on their return. These laws provoked Southern demands for a new federal statute to put teeth into the Fugitive Slave Clause. And so the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 became one of the strongest laws ever enacted by Congress. The act included the following provisions. It created a category of U.S. commissioners who are empowered to issue warrants for the arrest and return of fugitives to slavery. It allowed an affidavit by the claimant to be sufficient evidence of ownership and denied the fugitive the right to testify in his or her own behalf. The commissioner would earn a fee of $10 if he found for the claimant, but only $5 if he released the fugitive. The commissioner could deputize any citizen to serve as a member of a posse to aid in enforcement of the law. Stiff fines or jail sentences could be meted out of those who refused such orders or who resisted the law. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act effectively created a class of professional slave catchers. Some of these men were simply kidnappers bearing forged affidavits who saw a chance to make a quick dollar by capturing free blacks and selling them south. It had a devastating impact on northern black communities. Many free blacks were in fact escaped slaves, even if they were not given the ability to testify on their own behalf. It left them helpless in the face of an affidavit certified by a Southern court. Thousands of northern blacks fled to Canada. The law pumped new life into black nationalism in the North by seeming to provide evidence that blacks could never live safely in the United States. Projects for immigration to Haiti, Central America, and Africa gained momentum during the 1850s. Blacks and whites formed vigilance committees to hide or protect fugitives from slave catchers and to give them legal assistance if arrested. Frederick Douglass was quoted as saying the best way to make the fugitive slave law a dead letter was to make a dozen or more dead kidnappers. And so we have the conflict of 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise's ban on slavery in the Louisiana Purchase territory north of the 3630 parallel. The Burns Affair. Anthony Burns was an escaped Virginia slave who had escaped to Boston and gone to work in a clothing store when he was suddenly seized on May 24, 1854. A vigilance committee assaulted a federal courthouse. The Pierce administration then sent troops to secure the return of the slave to Virginia. Burns became the last slave to be returned from Boston or any other New England state. These states passed new personal liberty laws. Typically, the provisions were the appointment of a state attorney to defend fugitives, state payment for all defense costs, the denial of the use of any public building for the detention of fugitives, and new stringent anti-kidnapping statutes and trials for accused fugitives. It had the effect of making the slave-catching enterprise costly and time-consuming. The Supreme Court once again finally weighed in on the fugitive slave issue in Abelman v. Booth, 1859. Wisconsin abolitionist Sherman Booth was convicted by a federal court and imprisoned for leading a raid in 1854 that had freed a fugitive held in custody. Now, mind you, most of these Supreme Court justices that we're talking about were nominated by Andrew Jackson. We talked about that in either part 1 or part 2. You have to go back and see, but he got the opportunity to nominate about 5 judges, and then his successor, which was like his next in line, nominated about 3. So all of these judges were nominated by Jacksonian Democrats. So the Wisconsin Supreme Court had ruled the slave law unconstitutional and ordered Booth's release. The federal attorney appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Roger Taney spoke for the majority ruling on the fugitive slave law. They ruled it constitutional and declared any state interference with its enforcement unconstitutional. Booth went back to prison. Federal law has superseded state law in favor of the South, which is ironic because the South and the Democratic Party had claimed to be the defenders of states' rights. But in this particular incident, the federal law actually outweighed the state's law. So black laws took effect in several lower northern states, and black laws took effect in California and Oregon. In 1851, the Indiana Constitution of 1851 adopted a provision forbidding black migration to the state. This supplemented the state laws barring blacks already there from voting, serving on juries, or in the militia, testifying against whites in court, marrying whites, or going to school with whites. Followed by Iowa in 1851, Illinois in 1853, later Oregon in 1859. California also adopted all kinds of discriminatory legislation. So here we go. When it comes down to these reparations argument, you got these black laws that took effect in these lower northern states and in California and in Oregon. These measures reflected the racist sentiments of most whites in those states. The exclusion laws also served as conciliatory assurances to the South that no fugitives would be welcomed in these states. Most Western settlers clearly wanted no black people in their midst, slave or free. Racism was so pervasive in the North that no party could win if they fully endorsed racial equality. And so we have the prevalence of nativism and the rise of the know-nothings. And in the 1850s, whites suffered from ethnic and sectional conflict as a major political issue. So in the 1850s, whites were extremely divided. The origins of this conflict lay in the increase of immigration after 1845, land shortages and labor surpluses in Europe, as well as the Irish potato famine and the revolutions of 1848 caused millions to immigrate. America had high wages, cheap land, and a booming economy. From 1846 to 1845, or to 1846 to 1855, more than 3 million immigrants entered the United States, and 87% of them settled in free states. The Know-Nothings' main goal was to restrain the growing political party of immigrants. They went into politics organized under the name of the American Party. They wanted to lengthen the naturalization period from 5 years to 21 years, to permit only citizens to vote, to restrict office holding to native-born citizens. Temperance and education also became linked to nativism. We talked about the education reform movement and the temperance reform movement in part 1 and 2 as well. So Abraham Lincoln described the situation. How can anyone who abhors the oppression of Negroes be in favor of the degrading classes of white people? Our progress and degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we begin by declaring that all men are created equal. Now we practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When Know Nothings get in control, it will read, all men are created equal except Negroes, foreigners, and Catholics. And so with that, we have the emergence of Kansas as a state and the rise of the Republican Party.